Wonderful. So I'm DeSann Davis. I'm a PhD scientist, and I'm the program manager here at RockEDU. And the mission of RockEDU is to offer many opportunities for all of you, your friends, your teachers, and your neighbors to engage with science as a relevant human endeavor, and for you to explore ways that science is relevant to your lives. And we're really excited about the talk today because we think that this is one that's really relevant to our lives and our communities, and learning how to talk about addiction as a scientist and using the data that we know about addiction to inform how we think about and approach addiction as a society, we think is super, super important. So we're really, really looking forward to this talk today. So our talk is going to be presented by Devon Collins. Devon is a graduate student here at Rockefeller. Being a graduate student means that Devon already graduated from undergrad. He graduated from Ball State University after growing up in Chicago. It means that he's now pursuing his PhD. So he's been at that for about, yeah. Go ahead, applaud that. That's great. So he's 5 years into that endeavor and finishing up his PhD, which is really him dedicating a whole lot of time, a little bit as you'd think of as a student, learning things in traditional ways, but mostly learning things through his own discoveries and his own research and his work at the bench. And he's going to share some of what he knows and some of his work with us today. Between graduating from undergraduate and joining Rockefeller, Devon worked as both a research assistant, I have to get correct which is which, research assistant at Indiana State School of Medicine, and as a research technician at the University of Chicago. And then we were lucky enough to get him to New York here. And so specifically here at Rockefeller, Devon is working in the lab of Dr. Mary Jean Creek. She's one of the very first women scientists, women heads of lab here at the Rockefeller University. She's an amazing woman with an amazing story, and she and her lab have made remarkable contributions to our current understanding of addiction as disease, and specifically of addiction as a treatable disease. And Devon's going to be telling us a lot about that today because that's an important part of addiction research today. Outside of the lab, Devon does a lot of stuff for us with RockEDU, including that he's been the instructor or one of the instructors for our Learning at the Bench program, formerly known as the After School program, now known as the Jumpstart program. I'm going to plug it for a second because nominations just opened. So if you guys are interested in a research opportunity where you get to go from like passion and the cool, interesting things that make you guys want to come sit in these chairs to learning the actual skills and techniques that you need in order to spend a whole summer doing research with us, this is the Lab Jumpstart program. It starts after school in the spring and continues as a full-time summer research experience. There's a stipend, there's Metro cards, there's food. We take really good care of you guys. You get to hang out with really cool people. Probably not Devon this year because he's graduating and moving on, but other cool people like Devon. And it's a really great opportunity if you're interested in exploring what it means to actually do science research. So if you're interested, you need to have a teacher nominate you. The nominations are open, and as soon as that teacher completes the nomination, you get to start working on your application. You can check it out on our website, www.rockefeller.edu/outreach. That's also a great place to sign up for our newsletter, though if you signed up through Eventbrite, you'll be automatically added to our newsletter to know about future events like this and other cool things that we're running, all right? All right, I've said a lot. We're going to let Devon take over and tell you his great story about his work with addiction research.
All right. All right, let me get plugged in here real quick. Does anybody watch Steven Universe? Yeah! Who's your favorite gem? Garnet? Yeah. All right. All right, we got some technical difficulties here for a sec. Cool. All right, we got it. All right, so like DeSanne said, I'm a graduate student here at the Rockefeller University, and I work for a woman named Mary Jean Creek. And in the Creek Lab, we're really interested in studying addiction in lots of different ways. So some of the things we do are explore some of the neurobiological mechanisms that go into making people addicted. And we also think about some of the other biological factors like genetics that can predispose some people to addiction and maybe even protect others from developing addiction in the first place. And so what I want to talk about with you today is some of what scientists have been able to learn about how addiction takes place and some of the changes that drugs can wreak on the brain. But first, I want to think about this in like a historical and global perspective, right? So we all know that addiction is a really big deal, right? I'm sure that like you all agree. People have used mind-altering substances for thousands and thousands of years. And unfortunately, for some of us, repeated use of some of those substances, and for some people, that can lead to the disease of addiction. And that means that people have thought a lot about it, right? So addiction is a big deal. It has tremendous personal, interpersonal, economic, and societal costs. And so that means that people really want to figure out why addiction happens and also what to do about it, right? And so unfortunately, because we didn't always have science to figure out what was going on with this disease, there's been a lot of historical misconceptions about what causes it. And what I want to talk about is what scientists have been able to learn to dispel some of those myths and like really bad stereotypes about personal willpower and like lack of morality and stuff, which is just not true, right? All right, so drug use and addiction. So let's think about what kinds of drugs people actually use. And there are lots of different kinds, right? There are things like alcohol, there's methamphetamine, marijuana, prescription pills. You guys watch House? Yeah. All right. What about narcos? Cocaine. And who recognizes this? What's it from? Yeah, okay, cool. I thought that you might be too young for that reference, but that's great. All right, so those are some of the things that people do use, right? How many people have used? And I want you to keep in mind that the numbers I'm about to show you are from a survey of Americans aged 12 or older, all right? So keep that in mind. All right. 260 million people in the US, 12 or older, have ever used drugs. So again, keep that in mind. Ever used them in their life, right? Not drugs, alcohol. Woo. 15 million have used methamphetamine. 104 million have ever used marijuana. About 37 million have ever used prescription pills. For cocaine, it's about 46 million. And about 5.7 million have ever used heroin. So that's how many people in the US over age 12 have ever used those drugs, right? But not all of those people are going to go on to develop addiction, right? So how many people go on to develop dependency or addiction? For alcohol, it's about 16 million people. And these numbers are actually, I don't know why both of those went up, whatever. And these numbers are actually people in the year 2015 from some national survey data. These are people who qualified for chemical dependency, right? So in 2015, about 16 million people met the criteria for alcohol dependency or addiction. About 872,000 for methamphetamine, about 4 million for marijuana. Prescription pills, that's about 6 million. And this number is actually really interesting because this, even though prescription pills are like a really broad category, so they include things like barbiturates and tranquilizers and stimulants, this number really represents a huge number of people who are using prescription opioids, so things like painkillers like Vicodin, OxyContin, and Percocet. About 896,000 met the criteria for cocaine dependence, And about 591,000 people were dependent on or addicted to heroin. And I want to zero in on this number just a little bit closer and kind of dissect something about it. When people regularly expose themselves to heroin, which is an opioid drug, about 20 to 33% of people go on to develop an addiction when they regularly expose themselves to that drug. And that keys us into something. That's actually a really huge percentage. Because if you look at something like alcohol or cocaine, there's a big percentage of those people who get addicted to those drugs, but it's only about 6 to 12 compared to this much bigger number here. And that clues us in about something that might be special about opioids. And so I'm going to go a little bit further into that drug because it's actually what I study in the lab. So before we do that, let's think about some of the factors that go into creating an addiction. And my slide has kind of like jumped the gun here. But I like to think about 3 different areas that can kind of encompass the different factors that go into making an addiction. So things like biology, and examples of those are things like genetics, physiology, which is the way that the systems in your body function, cognition, which is how your brain kind of takes in, processes, and deals with information, and then neurochemistry, which is how the cells in your brain talk to one another. In the environment, there are factors like stressors, social pressure, drug exposure, and this is super key because addiction is a disease that requires something from the outside changing biology, right? So you're not going to have an addiction if you don't have drug exposure. So this is a really important environmental factor, right? And it's kind of a no-brainer. There are also drug cues, which signal availability of drugs in the environment. So if you are a person who has an addiction and you see like something that can signal the availability of your drug of choice in the environment, then that's going to cue you in and maybe might cause craving or something like that. And then there are pharmacological aspects to addiction, right? So once a drug is on board and in your body, where is it working? What's the target? When it's at its target, what's the mechanism by which it exerts its effects? And once those effects have started, how long do they last? And so we're going to zero in today's talk on some of the biological factors, including physiology, cognition, and neurochemistry. And we're also going to look at some of the pharmacological factors like drug target. And it's going to lead us to one of my favorite proteins ever. It's really great. All right, but before we do that, I want to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page and come up with a framework that we're going to think about today's talk in, right? So I want you to keep some things in mind. All right, so we've got a brain, right? And that's really important for lots of things. I think the brain is a really cool part of the body because it does so much for us, right? It regulates our heartbeat. It helps coordinate things like digestion. It communicates with all of these different organs and helps to coordinate their activities and help you live, right? But the brain also does a lot of other things for us that I'm going to get into in just a few slides, right? So I've kind of already given you the answer, but what do all of these things have in common? What are they? Organs, exactly, right? And so what happens when, actually, come on. All right, there you go. All right, so you already got kind of a reveal there. But, so let's look more closely at 2 of these organs, right? When you have heart disease, what are some of the consequences of that? Anybody? Yeah. Myocardial infarction, right? That's a nice piece of vocabulary. That's good. All right, what else? What does the heart do? Let's think about it in that regard. What does the heart do for you? It pumps blood, right? So if you have a myocardial infarction or heart disease, right, that means that the heart can't pump blood as well, right? All right, so what if you have an organ that's responsible for behavior? What do you think? The behaviors might be changed, right? Because the brain is an organ that's responsible for generating behaviors. And so addiction involves behaviors in that it's a disease of the brain, right? And so when you think about what the brain does for us, you can think a lot about how addiction might change what our behaviors are, right? And that's illustrated really well here. Oh man, that was a bad voice crack. It's illustrated right here in this chart, or in this cartoon, in that this diseased heart on the right here is functioning differently than a healthy heart. And likewise, a diseased brain is functioning differently from a healthy brain, right? I'm kind of batting you over the head with these things, but I want to make sure that we keep these in mind, all right? And what's really cool about this specific example is that this disease that this brain is suffering from is a specific disease of cocaine addiction. All right, so we've established that the brain is an organ, and the brain can get sick, right? We also know that the brain helps us to understand and adapt to our surroundings. So like I was saying, the brain helps us generate behaviors, and some of those behaviors need to be adaptive. And I'm going to illustrate that to you right now, right? All right, so if you're thirsty, this image probably looks really good to you right now, right? So imagine that you're like an animal that's super thirsty out on the savannah, you haven't had water for days, and then you see some signs of water in the environment, right? What are you going to do? You're going to follow those signs and you're going to try to find water, right? Because your body needs it. It's really important for survival. And so you find some water, you drink it, you get your fill, and then you're done, right? You can stop drinking. So you don't just like drink water forever and ever and ever just because you were thirsty once, right? So your brain can adapt. It helped you to generate the behaviors necessary to find and get the water. And then it stopped those behaviors, right? And it turns out that there are brain systems that are in place for both of those things. And this is really important because you can put a brake on the system. So like this baby does not want that food, you can say no to certain things that are otherwise good in other contexts. All right, so we know that learning and adapting behavior is essential to life, and that the brain does this for us. And learning and adapting is really important because we want to make more of these, right? We have to survive and grow and reproduce. I love blue. All right, so keeping those things in mind, let's talk a little bit about the brain, and then we can get into what drugs do to it. Dang, I hope that Blue Ivy and Beyonce don't like upstage my whole thing. All right, so we're thinking about the brain, that means we're thinking about neurons, right? And they're one of my favorite cell types because they're super specialized for communicating with one another. And the way that they do that is through a combination of action potentials, which are electrical signals, and through neurotransmitters, which are chemical signals. And so let's take a look at how they might, one of the ways that they can communicate with one another. So this cell on the left here is what we call a presynaptic cell, because its cell body has a little extension that extends to another cell, the postsynaptic cell, and they meet at a synapse, right? And that's the point of communication between them. So if we take a closer look at those, at that synapse, we can see that this presynaptic cell is using chemical signals in the form of neurotransmitters to send information to that postsynaptic cell, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. All right. And the way that the postsynaptic cell can respond to that signal is coming from outside of the cell itself, in this case from another cell, but is using specialized proteins that are in its membrane at the synapse, and those are called receptors, right? So this is from, thanks Khan Academy, this is from like another example, but this is a general principle that happens in your brain in lots of different contexts, right? And it turns out that it's really important for addiction. All right, so one of the receptors that cells use to respond to certain signals are called opioid receptors, and this is a kind of protein that I study every day in the lab. And receptors, like I said, allow cells to respond to signals coming from the outside, and so opioid receptors allow cells to respond to opioids, right? So this is a cute little receptor here in the membrane. We have extracellular, intracellular, all that good stuff, right? You guys know that. And then we have an opioid that comes in, and I'm going to call this binding to the receptor. So the opioid comes in and interacts and binds with that receptor, right? And some examples of things that interact with opioid receptors are things that your body makes, or endogenous opioids. We call endogenous things that are produced by your body, right? So those are things like endorphins. You've heard of endorphins, right? Cool. So there are also exogenous things, and those are things that are introduced from outside of your body. And good examples of that are morphine, oxycodone, and heroin, and a really important medication called methadone that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. All right, so we have an example of a receptor, we have opioid receptors, and we have opioids that interact with them, right? So what is going on that allows that when that cell is responding to the opioid signal, right? All right, so now we have kind of a schematic of a couple of proteins that are affected by opioids. So we have the receptor here. So what happens when an opioid comes in is that a chemical signal gets propagated. And that signal can go on to affect the activity of other proteins in the cell. And I'm not going to go into like what these are or what they do, even though they're really interesting. And if you have specific questions, you can ask me about them later. But what I want you to take away is that the summation of all these effects on these proteins, for a lot of neurons, is less excitability. And so let's get into a little bit of what that means, right? So I told you that neurons communicate with one another by pumping neurotransmitters onto other neurons, right? And so they do that because they can send electrical signals that make the chemical signals propagate, right? But if they're less excitable and they're sending fewer electrical signals, that means that they will send less chemical signal, right? Does this make sense to everybody? Right? Okay, cool. So opioids reduce the activity of this presynaptic cell. That means that it sends less chemical signals to its blue neighbor here, right? This postsynaptic cell. So opioids reduce neuronal activity and they reduce neurotransmitter release. And this is one of the many things that opioids can do to cells, but I'm going to zero in on this one particular example. All right, so a place where this is actually really important is in the parts of your brain that have to do with a neurotransmitter called dopamine, and parts of your brain that process information about rewards, right? And again, rewards are things that are like good, right? Pleasurable or good. And it turns out that one of the places that dopamine is involved in helping your brain process rewards is a place called the nucleus accumbens. And that's a little region in the front of your brain that uses dopamine to process information about rewards. And that dopamine comes from another area in the midbrain called the VTA, the ventral tegmental area. I'm going to call it VTA for short. And a lot of cells that produce dopamine live in the VTA. And they send their axons and project forward into the nucleus accumbens where they can release dopamine into the cells that live there. All right, so let's take a closer look at that projection. All right, and I want you to remember that I have them cartooned here and they look like they're really close together. But if you think back to that last slide, they're actually kind of far apart in the brain. Cool? All right. So these dopamine cells are hanging out in the ventral tegmental area in the VTA. And they release dopamine onto cells in the nucleus accumbens that are responsible for generating rewards, right? For helping your brain interpret rewards. And so the dopamine is doing its thing, and we get a reward, right? But that's not the whole picture. Those dopamine cells are not alone, and they're in the company of other neurons called GABA that use a different neurotransmitter, called GABA cells that use a different neurotransmitter called GABA. And what those do is make sure that the dopamine cells are kind of held in check, so that dopamine is only released when it's appropriate, when you've actually encountered a reward, right? So they're pumping, doing their thing, and they make sure that there's not too much dopamine here. And it turns out that that process is really important for lots of different kinds of rewards. You eat, you get dopamine. You hang out with your friends, you get dopamine. You dance and you listen to music, or you look at a picture of Michelle Obama and you get some dopamine, right? You have a positive social interaction, dopamine, right? And like I said, let's remember that all of these things are crucial to our survival, right? And so one of the interesting things about drugs and how they exert their effects is that they actually mimic the action of all these naturally rewarding things, and they can generate aberrant reward signals in the brain. So drugs mimic the action of natural rewards in the brain, and they take advantage of that dopamine circuit that I showed you a few slides back. So over time, you get like a natural reward, you get a little bit of dopamine, then it goes back down to zero, or not zero, but essentially zero for our purposes. And then the system is ready to respond to another reward later, right? Drugs, come on. There we go. Drugs do the same thing, but they hyperactivate those systems. And so it's happening in a way that's kind of aberrant for the normal biology. And what that leads to is a lot of huge changes that are actually not supposed to take place when dopamine is doing its thing. And so that leads me to the next piece of the puzzle, right? What's really interesting to me is that those GABA cells that control the activity of the dopamine cells, which participate in generating reward in the nucleus accumbens, those express opioid receptors. And remember, opioid receptors can decrease neuronal excitability, right? They can decrease the amount of message. And so what happens when opioids are present? Well, if those GABA cells are responding to it, that means that they send out less of their chemical signal GABA, right? That lets this dopamine cell kind of do its own thing. So what happens is that sometimes it'll fire a little bit too much. And then you get too much dopamine, more dopamine than you would get with a natural reward. And that leads to, I forgot I had that like pulsing. There we go. That leads to the euphoric feelings that people get when they take a drug. And in this case, it's an opioid, but dopamine surges are also involved in things like cocaine and meth and basically anything that's reinforcing. All right. So that accounts for some of why people take drugs. And so if you think about this imaginary line of motivation, right? So the intensity of the positive feelings that motivate you to take drugs are growing and growing until, and I think we know, they start to go away, right? So if you keep using drugs, they don't feel as good as they did the first time, right? So there's another piece of the puzzle that we need to think about. So your brain is really smart, and like we said, it's really important for survival. So it needs to operate within like a very specific set of parameters, right? And so that means that it needs to be able to adapt to the signals that it gets, and it turns out that it does that. And the effects overall is that there's less dopamine that gets released over time, right? So let's look at a couple of the ways that that happens. So let's look first at these cells that are expressing or have opioid receptors. All right, so we've got our cell here, hanging out with some opioids. They adapt. Some of the ways that they can adapt is by something called desensitization. They can turn off the receptors that are on their surface so they no longer respond to the opioid. They can also internalize those receptors. That means they pull them away from the surface so that they're no longer accessible to by the opioid, right? They also change the levels of receptors. So they can insert more, or they can take them away. Yeah, that was kind of a rough one. Right. And so all of these different changes can help normalize the activity of that dopamine circuit when it's exposed to those rewarding drugs. Let's take another look at some of the cells that respond to dopamine. So it turns out that dopamine, cells that respond to dopamine do that because they have dopamine receptors, right? That makes sense from what we learned about what receptors do. And those can adapt by, and one way that they can adapt is by taking away some of the receptors that are in their own cell surfaces, right? So you have less dopamine receptors. Even though you have more dopamine, they're not going to be hyper responsive to that extra dopamine, right? And so all of those changes kind of sum to get the kind of epiphenomenon that we see when people keep taking drugs. That is that the response that they get, those kind of positive feelings, over time start to get lower and lower and lower. And then to combat that, people who are taking drugs will start to increase the amount of drug consumed, right? And I'm kind of not telling you anything new about what people are doing, but I hope that you've been able to kind of like link what people's patterns of behavior are like to what's going on in their brains, right? So this change in behavior is an example of things that are like tolerance that we like to think about, right? And tolerance is increasing the amount of drug that's taken to maintain the effects. And I think that you're getting kind of a clear picture of why people might want to do that. And then there's the issue of dependence, right? Which is a dysfunction in the absence of drug. And what I've kind of shown you in these past few slides is that drugs change the way that the brain functions when you keep presenting the brain with those drugs, right? And so if it's changing the ways that it functions, then maybe if those changes persist when the drug isn't there, something might be wrong when you take the drugs away, right? All right, so a lot of those changes result in people having more craving for drugs and less control over how much drugs they take. And that's because all of those changes kind of reduce the amount of activity of those natural reward systems that are existing in the brain, right? So when you take the drug away, you get withdrawal symptoms like anxiety, depressed mood, and anhedonia. Can anybody tell me what anhedonia is? Do you know? No? All right, so it's like a state where natural things that would naturally be rewarding to you are no longer pleasurable. So like, if you think about people who are depressed, like they don't like hanging out with friends, they might not eat, they might not like to do things that they normally do, and that's because they're anhedonic, right? But it turns out that this So that is like why people might crave drugs a little bit more. And it turns out that there's another part of the brain that is involved in controlling the craving for drugs that is also affected by the action of drugs on the brain. And that's a place called the PFC. How many people have heard of this region? A few? Cool. All right. It's a really cool part of the brain because it allows us to exert self-control and executive functions like planning and like looking into the future and stopping our impulses, right? So the nucleus accumbens is a part of the brain that's really important for like wanting and desiring rewards and impulses, and the prefrontal cortex can talk to those regions and exert self-control, right? But it turns out that dopamine the way that dopamine works in the brain is not just to generate reward, it also helps the PFC do its job. So if you change dopamine actions there, you start to lose control over intake. And there are lots of scientists who are studying that. I'm kind of looking here, but there are others who are looking at the PFC and looking at how drugs can reduce the amount of self-control that we can exert over actions. All right, and I would be remiss if I didn't do a little bit of a PSA for you. Right. So this is, I hope I didn't blind anybody with that. Whoops. So if you think about where when those parts of the brain are maturing, there's actually a big difference in when some of them are maturing compared to others, right? So if you think about those places like the nucleus accumbens and those reward-related areas, they're actually in place super early in our development, and that makes sense because we need to know for basically our entire lives what is rewarding and what is aversive and all of that good stuff, right? But, and I think that you know this, and your parents probably tell you the same thing, that like the younger you are, the harder it is to exert self-control, right, and control your impulses. And that's because the parts of the brain that are responsible for generating that degree of behavioral control don't start to mature until till much later in life. And so you have reward and impulses maturing faster than the self-control. And so if you think about it, changing things that change those regions of the brain while they're still developing can spell a really bad time, right? So if you're wreaking havoc on the way that the brain functions while the brain is still growing and developing, you can change the way that it functions later in life in adulthood. And it's also worth pointing out that at the same times that those prefrontal self-control areas are developing, that's actually when people start to experiment with drugs, like the most, right? So you have this period of vulnerability between like around age 10 and around age 25. So that's my PSA for y'all, don't do drugs. All right, so we have a little bit more to our picture about why people continue to use drugs, right? As those positive feelings are starting to go away, negative feelings can start to come up because of things like withdrawals. So people stop using drugs because they feel good, and they start using drugs, or they keep using drugs, They keep using drugs because they don't want to feel bad when the drugs are gone and go into withdrawal. All right, and that's illustrated from actually a really cool study that was done way before anybody in this room was born, I think. In 1966, a group of researchers here at Rockefeller started working with opioid addicted patients. Actually, way before 1966, but this is when the paper was published. And so here we have a heroin addicted patient, and we can see the pattern of use over a couple of days. And so down here on this axis, we can see these little black arrows every time that they take a dose of heroin. And what they're trying to do is keep themselves above this line here, right? So like, I don't know if these might be like more 1960s sort of terms for like what people feel when they take drugs or don't. But people feel high, they feel normal, and they feel sick. They feel like they're in withdrawal. And so people are trying to are continuing to take drugs to keep themselves from falling below this line and feeling sick or feeling like they're in withdrawal. The problem with that is that over time, they kind of lose control over their intake, they might miscalculate, and then there's always a danger of overdose, and that's particularly dangerous with drugs like heroin and other opioids, right? So what you can see in this patient is that over the night, the levels of heroin in their blood went down, and in the morning they felt really sick, right? So they had to take a couple of more infusions to try to get it back up, didn't work, you take more, you back up, right? Didn't work, you take more, and that actually makes me think about a really sobering statistic that has to do with opioids and about a really sobering statistic and what's happening in the U.S. And that's that in 2016, and we had about 66,000 opioid-related overdose deaths. And that's an insane number, right? And that's an insane. So what can we do about it? Well, we spend a lot of time as addiction scientists figuring out some of the mechanisms that are involved in making or breaking an addiction. And that's led to some really great breakthroughs. And that's one of those things that we can do is prevent overdose deaths. One of those things that we can do is medication called Narcan. Have you guys heard of that? With a medication called Narcan. Yeah, some of you guys heard of that. So this is really great because it's something that we can use to prevent overdose deaths, especially with opioids. And what it does is, if you remember, opioids interact with the opioid receptors, right? There are lots of different things that can interact with opioid receptors. There are lots of the active ingredient interact with Narcan is a chemical called naloxone. And naloxone can interact with opioid receptors, just like endorphins, interact with morphine, just like heroin. But what's different about it is that it doesn't turn on the receptor. What's different about it is that you have interacting with the receptor to kick off those opioids. So you have interacting opioids that are contributing to the overdose that are causing you to overdose. But it doesn't turn them on into the overdose. So it can block the effects of those opioids. And that's really key. And so it can saving lives when people overdose. And that's really key. And saving lives when people overdose on an opioid like heroin. We've also learned a lot about how we might want to treat them, right? So I told you that some of the problems with addiction is that people lose some of the problems with addiction over their drug intake. But at the same time, they crave those drugs even more because at the same time, they don't have those drugs even more because they feel like they don't have the drugs on board. They feel sick. And so these are two examples of some medications. So these are two developed over the years that are actually really great for treating opioid addiction and that are actually really for treating opioid addiction and preventing people from. And that's Suboxone, and another one called methadone. And methadone's probably something. And another one called methadone. And methadone's probably something a lot of ads for Suboxone more than Suboxone too. So a lot of ads. And what they do is that here from that same study that I showed you from that same study that I showed you, have another patient who has heroin addiction, but they've been maintained on heroin. They're getting daily doses. They've been maintained on methadone, and they're getting daily doses of methadone, and then the H is hero. And there's some really cool things that are illustrated by. And there's some really cool things that first are illustrated by. Methadone allows people to stay within this really great, happy, good functioning area. Really great, happy. So they're not dipping below this line and feeling sick. So they're not dipping below this line and what's really cool is they're not getting high off of heroin. They feel like a little bit better, but they don't feel high. Heroin, they feel like. And so that blocks both those like positive reinforcing and the negative reinforcing, positive reinforcing and the negative reinforcing. So by maintaining people on methadone, doctors are able to and keep them from having those motivating cravings, and keep them from having those motivating factors like trying to stay out of withdrawals. And what's really cool about this particular, one of the most effective treatments for addiction, most developed right here treatments for addiction, and that was a group of 3 physician scientists, and that was a group who left their other areas of study to start, and that was something about the opioid epidemic at that time, and that was a group of people. I mean, I just wonder, and my boss, Mary Jean Creek, she looks a lot different than she does in this picture, it was like, this is like, I don't know, maybe this picture, it was like, this is like, I don't know, maybe 19, I have no idea. 70? Anyway, I have no idea. Anyway, so it's really cool because, I've gotten to be a part of this, like, really awesome legacy, because I've gotten to be a part of this, like, really awesome legacy of helping people. So I'm done with the science, I'm done with the PSAs, and I want to just take a moment to look back at the PSAs, and I want to just take a moment to look back at what we've learned, because I want to leave a lot of time. So first we learned that the brain is an organ responsible for generating adaptive behavior. This is probably something the brain is an organ that is affected by disease. The brain is an organ that is. Addiction is a disease of the brain that's caused by the effects. Addiction is a disease of the brain that's caused by the effects. The disease of addiction can alter behavior because it alters the disease of addiction can alter behavior because it alters the way that. And finally, I want you to remember that there are treatments that we have. And finally, I want you to remember that can help treatments that we have for addiction, prevent craving, that can help people control their behavior and prevent during that time. And something I didn't actually take during that time, and something I didn't actually actually say during the time that people are maintaining on medication, is that during the time that people are maintaining, it actually gives the brain a chance to heal, and to reverse some of the, it actually gives the brain a chance to heal, and to reverse some of the changes that have been wrought. And with that, I think I'm going to kind of leave it, and and with that, I think I'm going to kind of leave it, and I want to open it up for questions. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. We gotta wait. Okay. Is that enough time? All right. We gotta wait. Is that enough time? I can talk about myself.
What were your motivations? What were your motivations?
Sorry?
What was your motivation?
Sorry? For what?
What was your motivation?
Study this? For what? That's a heavy question. Study this? Oh man, that's a heavy question. The thing that I really like about it is I've been a neuroscientist. The thing that I really like about it is I've been a neuroscientist for a long time. And what was really cool about addiction is that, I get to study some really fundamental things about the brain. Answering questions that are really answering some questions that are really important for human health. I think it's really cool because addiction is a really important problem. I think it's really cool because addiction is a really important problem. We need to study. And I just really liked being a part of the group that was doing that. So yeah, that's the honest truth. Cool.
So my question was in the beginning when you were talking about statistics,
Yeah.
you said how many 4 million people did this drug.
Yeah.
You said 4 million people get addicted to marijuana didn't have addictive qualities. I thought that marijuana didn't have any addictive qualities to it. So I was
Yeah. So what's really interesting about those numbers that I show you is that those represent people who qualify for. Those represent people who qualify for the DS dependence, according to something called the DS manual, right? And it's something that doctors and psychiatrists manual, and something that doctors and psychiatrists, especially mental illnesses and addiction is with mental illnesses, and so their criteria for being dependent on the and so their criteria for being dependent on the use, and that means that people have daily use, they have to use trouble within a certain controlling how much they use, so within a certain something that something that people using regularly might sometimes actually look like dependence or like addiction. I don't want to give you a false sense of comfort that that's kind of what I'm for every case. But I think that's kind of what I'm going to say. I think the question that you're really asking though is marijuana addictive? So I would say that it can be. So I would say that it can be. Yes. But that addiction, no two addictions are the same, just like no two cancers are the same, right? So these are really complex diseases. And so the addiction to different drugs, depending on the drug, might look different. You might not get super depending on the drug symptoms. So you might not get super severe withdrawal symptoms in the same way that you would get from opioid addiction, because the changes that are happening in the brain. I'm probably physically I'm definitely physically dependent. My caffeine withdrawal looks different. But my caffeine withdrawal looks different. A headache, around 2 p.m. because I get a little bit of a headache, around 2 p.m. I get a little cranky. But that looks different than being, and I get a little cranky. But that looks different than being addicted or dependent on other drugs, right? Yeah.
Over here. What are some misconceptions about the brain and addiction?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions about. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about addiction. I need to ask you another question. I need to ask you another question. Actually. So do you mean what's the biggest misconception? What's the biggest misconception, or what's a big misconception about about the brain is related to addiction, or about the brain and about addiction? I just made my life harder, right? All right. I just made my life harder, right? So one of the biggest misconceptions. How about this? So one of the biggest misconceptions about addiction that I kind of alluded to but didn't really get into talk is in the beginning of the talk is that addiction is the product of moral failing or lack of willpower, right? And so I think it might seem from my talk that that really explains it, because there is an issue of loss of self-control and loss of intake over drug-related behavior. But the thing is that loss of intake and that impairment of will actually has a cause that's related to the way that the brain functions. So I think that people often forget that the habits and the behaviors that go along with addiction have an organic cause. They come from the brain because the brain is the seat of behavior, right? So I think that's a big misconception that people have, that the loss of self-control doesn't have anything to do with the way the brain
Take a question over here.
Thank you.
We'll take a question over here.
How does behavioral therapy help with people who are addicted?
So that's a really great question. So I really lauded I really give a lot of praise to things like medication-assisted therapy, right? And those are really essential to our ability to treat addiction. But any complete treatment regimen actually involves things like behavioral therapy, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really important for interrupting patterns of behavior, right? So it makes it a lot easier for people if they're in the right therapeutic regimen, so that's like psychotherapy, along with medications when needed to manage their cravings. It really helps when they're in the proper psychotherapeutic context, because then they can learn when I hang out with my friends, I have cravings. All my friends who did drugs with me, I want to do drugs. Or when I allow myself to, when I feel stressed out and I don't occupy myself, I experience drug cravings. Or, so you can learn to recognize patterns of behavior, and psychotherapy, I think, is really important for that. Did I answer your question? All right, cool.
What are your future projects or research? What are your future projects or research you're thinking about?
My future projects. Cool. Yeah. So one thing I didn't tell you about is the work that the lab is doing to identify some of those. I think I kind of mentioned a little bit what makes some people more vulnerable or less vulnerable than others. And so one of the things that I look at is different versions of genes for the opioid receptor. So just like any protein, the information to make an opioid receptor protein, right, is found in your genes. And it turns out that there are individual differences in those genes that encode the receptor. So one of the projects that I'm really excited about getting into is looking at the effects of those genetic differences and what they do to the receptors and why those changed receptors. We actually know that some of those mutations can affect the way the receptors work. So I want to look really closely at what exactly is different about those receptors. Thanks.
I'll take a question.
To piggyback what the girl in the back said, has hypnosis been used to treat addiction?
That's a really good question. It's actually something I don't know a lot about. I would imagine that it has, but I can't tell you yes or no. I'm really sorry.
Let's get a question right here.
So I'm pretty sure that I read a statistic that in the U.S., smoking cigarettes kills more than all the drugs combined. So is smoking cigarette addiction different, and is it more severe in any way?
So one thing you have to keep in mind with certain kinds of drugs is that the things that come along with them are really can be really different, right? So with smoking cigarettes, I'm not sure about those statistics, and I'm sorry that I didn't include nicotine on my slides, but it's definitely an addictive substance, right? One of the things that's really interesting about smoking is when you think about any addiction, is how are you taking in those drugs, right? So drugs like heroin can be really dangerous and harmful to our health because if you're injecting them, which is a really popular way, at least in the 1980s and kind of growing now, of taking that in, right? And that means that you have communicable diseases like HIV, like HCV, like Hep C, right? And so those can be harmful to health in other ways. But if you're smoking something, then you're also taking in that smoke, and you have other complications that are not necessarily brought by the drug itself on the brain or on the body, but by the smoke and the tar and all the chemicals and stuff that are in cigarettes.
That are people just
using more cigarettes than they are.
Also, yeah, we have to think about like what's legal and what's not. So access to cigarettes is really huge, right? Like people can smoke when they're 18, people can drink when they're 21. So some of those numbers might be bigger because people have bigger access to the drug. More people use alcohol. So we saw that 260 million people had ever, it's a legal drug, right? Compared to something that's really illegal and heavily policed like heroin. So those numbers are a lot smaller.
We still take questions.
So, you said that an unhealthy brain that's addicted to drugs can affect other parts of the body, like the heart. So, how does taking in less dopamine affect other parts of the body and other parts of the brain?
So what I would say to that is that when the brain is functioning differently, one really cool thing and another project that I'm interested in is how drugs affect stress systems in the brain, right? And so there are parts of your brain, and a good example is a part of your brain called the hypothalamus, right? And that is important for generating your brain's and your body's responses to stresses. And so an interesting thing about lots of different drugs, especially opioids, is that it can affect the way that those parts of your brain, like the hypothalamus that are responsible for coordinating lots of different parts of your body, right? It changes how those function. So it changes the way that your brain can control parts of your body through it, right? And so, so some of those changes, I don't know about dopamine specifically, but some of the changes that are affected in the brain by drugs can affect how your brain communicates and coordinates the different parts of your body, especially through things like stress.
Just FYI, we have already distributed all of our keychains, but we want to make sure everybody can get a question in because we think this is a very important
Your
topic.
incentive is an answer to your question.
Yes,
All right.
here.
I have two questions. One is, what exactly, in terms of age, is it easier to be addicted in certain ages than others? So, like, as a teenager, would it be easier to be addicted than as an adult or as a child? Or
do you mean in terms of like what someone's lived experiences, or do you mean like is it easier to become addicted at certain times?
yeah, is it easier to become addicted, statistically speaking, at like what age or roundabout?
Gotcha. Yeah. So if you remember, and I guess I should have left my computer plugged in. I'm going to answer both questions, but I want to make sure that I answer both and don't forget because I'm old. So yeah, like I was saying, with some of the parts of your brain that are responsible for regulating like how you can control craving and how you can control your impulses, they're still developing when you're younger. So exposing a younger brain to drugs is definitely really dangerous. Exposing any brain to drugs too much can be really, can cause a lot of problems. But if that brain is developing, then that means that it's a specific vulnerable period where lots of even bigger changes can happen. So like, so me taking a drug is a lot different than any of you taking a drug, right? Because my brain, a lot of those pathways are in place. Not very much of it is developing in the same way or to the same extent as yours is. So I would say that I don't know about in terms of being easy, but it definitely makes a bigger difference when you're younger.
One other thing, in terms of how easy it is to overdose, at what age is your brain more sensitive to overdose as well?
Oh, so this is another thing. Yeah, so it's a very individual sort of thing, right? Thank you these are both really great questions, right? Again, in terms of age, I don't really know, but it's kind of a very individual thing, right? So like I said, people develop tolerance and dependence in different ways, and there may be some like age correlates to that. But what really happens is that when people, say for instance for opioids, do you guys know, oh my God, Philip Seymour Hoffman, right? All right, or like Corey Monteith, right? What may have happened with them, and I'm not their doctor, I don't know, is that people who have had trouble with opioid addiction in the past, they develop things like tolerance, so they can take more and more and more and more without overdosing, right? But let's say that there's a period where they don't take those drugs, and then later they come back and they're like, oh, I was able to take this much before. I should be able to do that. Well, that tolerance and dependence starts to go away actually pretty quickly after a while. And so you come back and you take more, and boom, you overdose. It's a lot easier. And yeah, so I wish I knew a little bit more about how age might come into that, but it's a really good question.
How can we apply this to the medical professions?
Oh, that's a great question. All right, so opioid drugs specifically are some of the most powerful medications we've ever had, right? Like I said, people have used drugs for a long time, right? And morphine and opioids are something that we've used for a super, super long time, right? So like opium and codeine and all that. And that's because not only are they addictive, they're super powerful pain relievers, right? And they're like actually some of the most effective pain relievers that we had. So like, I'm sure y'all are at the age where you're like getting your wisdom teeth out, right? So who's had their wisdom teeth taken out? I have, right? So my doctor gave me a prescription for hydrocodone, which is an opioid, right? Now, I didn't need it. So if your doctor gives you all that hydrocodone, don't take it unless you absolutely need it, all right? But yeah, so medically, that was kind of an aside. I'm sorry, I got a little away. But yeah, so medically, opioids are really useful. But because they're so useful, and because they also have the terrible side effects of dependence and addiction, that means that they're kind of fraught, right? Like they carry dangers. So the more that we use them, and and when we don't use them properly, that means that we're more vulnerable to getting people dependent and getting people addicted. And so one of the things that doctors can do, and then the medical profession in general can do, is to better educate doctors and like new medical students and stuff about how to use opioid medications properly, which is something we don't do enough. And then another thing that I think medical professionals are really poised to do really well is to put pressure on Congress and put pressure on drug distributors to not over-push or deregulate how we manage opioid drugs, because they can be really dangerous.
Let's get something over here. We've been neglecting your edge of the room here.
I was wondering if it's possible for recovering addicts to become addicted to their treatment medication, and if so, what do you do when that happens?
Such a great question. All right, so that is actually a really huge misconception that we're really hoping to fight. So a lot of the pushback against methadone and treatments like it, like methadone and Suboxone, is that people are saying like, okay, you're just substituting one drug for the other, right? But let's think about it this way, all right? I already showed you that like people who are methadone maintained don't get high off of that methadone, right? And the same goes for the Suboxone. Now let's say that somebody is suffering from depression because of chemical changes that are going on in the brain. We know that antidepressants are going to help normalize that and allow the brain to heal, right? They may take those antidepressants for the rest of their life. They might stop taking those antidepressants, right? So if you think about addiction in that same way, like you're giving somebody a medication that allows them to manage their symptoms, right? And because of the way that those addiction medications work, people are not addicted to those medications, right? Yeah, I think that's what we're going to go with. And you can also think about it like this way. You're addressing, like I said, those changes are in the brain cause dysfunction in the absence of that drug that people are addicted to, right? And I told you a little bit about how methadone is able to work, and that it mimics the effects of your natural endorphins, which you're not addicted to, right? They're like things that your body make that are like there for normal function. And because of that, I lost my train of thought. Because of that, it's like you're allowing those receptors to function normally, you're not inducing those highs, you're not getting that aberrant signaling, you're just replacing something that you've kind of lost, right? So think about like diabetes and insulin. You get type 2 diabetes, your body doesn't make insulin anymore, you need to replace that insulin, right? You change the way that your endorphins and opioid receptors work so they have less functionality, you can replace that, right? Yeah.
Question here.
Let's say a baby is born with a heroin addiction because the mother did heroin. How do they treat that addiction in the child? And also, are they more prone in their lifetime to become addicted again?
Oh, those are really good questions. Right, yeah, so those like a baby that's born dependent, right? There are lots of different detoxification options that people have. I'm not a doctor, so I can't really tell you about them. But like I said, there are medications and there are treatments that we use for people who are addicted to heroin and other drugs that I think would be effective. I actually have 2 members of my lab in here who might be able to help me out. What do you think?
I do know that I believe that they do very low dose, like some methadone or Suboxone. Yeah, people can use that. Obviously the like amount is very, very different. Yeah. But people can use that for children. And there's actually a lot of really interesting research that other people in our lab are doing to kind of answer your second question. Like, can an addiction early in life or dependency early in life, depending on if it's, an infant or even a younger person, affect your likelihood of getting addicted later in life also? Yeah, so there's actually a lot of research looking at in mice and a lot of longitudinal research and like archival research in people, looking at how drug exposure, like during and after pregnancy and then like early in life, can predispose or kind of jump the gun here, but like can change the likelihood of being addicted later. And so it actually turns out in like animals like rodents that's actually the case. So drug exposure during especially certain parts of pregnancy, especially when like the brain is developing, that can predispose those animals to more drug taking behavior later. And we can actually train animals to take drugs themselves. So it's actually really cool. And then with people, people who have early life adversity and who are exposed to drugs earlier in life have a bigger chance of developing addictions later, specifically actually with cannabis. So yeah.
We have time for about 1 or 2 more questions before we get out to the networking activities. So, sure? Okay. Here we go.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
My first question is that the treatments that have been made, do they only work on certain drugs or do they work on all drugs in general?
Okay, that's a really great question. They've all been great questions, but this is really great. We're excited about it. Yeah, so the treatments that I have up here, Suboxone and methadone, they're really effective for opioid addiction, right? And so a big problem, and another thing that the lab is working on, and actually Amy, who helped me out with that last question, is working on a specific, there's a big lack for specific addiction treatments for other kinds of addiction, right? So I'm thinking primarily of things like cocaine, which is another really common addiction that people have. And we don't have any medications that are specific for that, and my colleague Amy is actually working on figuring out a medication that can help address that. But I do have to say that, especially when people are using like more than one kind of drug, addressing the problem with one drug, like an opioid, can also help address the problems with other things like cocaine if you're like a combination user. And opioids are involved in lots of other addictions, so helping the opioid system heal can probably help other addictions as well.
And my second question is there a treatment that has been created that cuts off drug addiction like really fast, or if not, are we starting to come up with one?
Oh man, I wish that we had something like that. Addiction is a really chronic disease. So kind of like the example I gave with mental illness like depression or with diabetes, it's a chronic disease, and we can kind of heal some of the changes, but there are a lot of changes that we don't understand well enough to be able to reverse yet. And we're actually not sure if they're permanent or not. And so it's a continual process, and medication definitely helps, and people can stay drug-free for the rest of their lives if they keep up with their treatments. But unfortunately, we can't cure it yet.
Question here. So you mentioned before that that if you get treatment
Mm-hmm.
and you don't take drugs for a while, your brain starts to heal itself.
Mm-hmm.
How exactly does that work in your brain? Like, what happens, and how do the opioid receptors react and such?
Yeah, so When people take drugs like, some examples I'm thinking of are morphine or like an opioid, right, or cocaine, what actually happens is that the numbers of receptors in the brain change. Like the number of opioid receptors in the brain can change. But the amount of endorphins that like supply them with signal doesn't actually change. And so you have this relative deficiency of endorphins, and that in part leads to that dependence, right? And that's one of the things that methadone and other medications can address. But over time, if you maintain people on methadone, those like receptor numbers start to go back to normal, and some of the changes in the dopamine system start to go back to normal as well. And I think I was telling another one of you all about stress systems in the brain. So it turns out that drug use can really affect the way that your brain responds to stress. And we think that that's also involved in why people take drugs, right? Because things like withdrawal and craving are really stressful. And so we see that there's like an inability of your body to properly regulate its responses to stress. And a lot of that is contained within parts of the brain. And we can see that when people receive adequate treatment, those parts of the brain start to go back to normal and they can re-regulate their stress. Yeah.
So we'll have one last question. Over here. Hi. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting.
Thanks for listening.
So what's the side effect of methadone, I think is the medicine that you guys use to help people with opioid addiction?
Mm-hmm.
And what happens to your brain when you have an overdose?
Oh, cool.
Or your heart, you die from your brain, you die from your heart. What exactly is
so I'm going to answer your second question first because it's a little more straightforward. Well, it's a little bit within my knowledge base, right? And so with an opioid specifically, one of the things that kills you is respiratory depression. So there are lots of opioid receptors throughout the brain. And I was only talking about specific populations of receptors and reward circuits, but they are also in your brainstem, in places that regulate things like your heart rate and your breathing, right? And so it turns out that like when you get to certain concentrations, first it's like the really good ones, the like perfect concentrations for like hitting the receptors in your reward systems. But then as you up that, it can start to affect the function of those parts of your brain, like in the brainstem, that are regulating your respiratory rate. And so people stop breathing and they asphyxiate. And that's one of the things that kills people during overdose. And then as far as side effects, I actually don't know of that many, and I'm going to go to my colleagues again. Do we know about side effects?
Generally with methadone, there's not that very many side effects, honestly.
Yeah.
It is contraindicative for somebody with like liver issues because that's where it's primarily processed. So in people that have, comorbidity with alcoholism and they have cirrhosis, buprenorphine would be a better treatment option. But overall, it's actually very well received. Is there cardiac, like QTC?
I don't think so. There are definitely opioid receptors in the heart, but like I think that that it doesn't really have any of those like cardiovascular effects or anything like that. But yeah, this is Kyle Windish, who is a postdoc in my lab, who is like really awesome and also studying ways to treat other addictions. And yeah, so what she said.
Wonderful. Thank you guys for all those amazing questions.
Yeah, these are really great, guys. Thanks.
So I'm really glad actually that Devon got a chance to introduce that a few of his lab mates are here. One of the opportunities that you guys will have in the next phase of this is to move around and network with the scientists. So Devon will be around. He'll probably be able to take a few more questions if you guys have them. Guys, listen up. There's a few more instructions. And in addition to that, these scientists and a few more who are already waiting outside for you are going to be around with some questions that are like some true-false questions that we've given them. And you guys will have an opportunity to go up to each of those scientists and discuss with them what you think. Is it true? Is it false? Throw up your data point on our graphs, have a chat with them, collect a stamp from them that you have discussed with them about this question. And if you complete all 3 of the questions that are out there, You can participate in an activity where we get to throw some colored balls into buckets and simulate performing an action potential on sort of the human scale. So it should be kind of a fun activity. We hope that you guys will work in groups. You'll meet some new people. You'll find some others who have interests similar to yours. In addition to those activities, there's 2 more things. Sit down, please. Let me finish talking. All right. So one of the activities that you can do is you can experience what it feels like for your brain to undergo habituation, or that adaptation type behavior when your brain is starting to say, okay, too much, too much, too much. I need to readjust in some way to get back to a new level of normal. We have a few fun activities for you to experience what habituation feels like in your brain. And then we also have an opportunity for you to share some of what you learned today, because we think addiction is super important and not always talked about in the right ways. We want to give you the opportunity to communicate with your legislators, your policy-making people, to share with them what you've learned today about addiction, if you think that this is something that we should be thinking about as something that affects our communities and our societies. And so we have resources for lots of people that you can write to, some things you can write about, some legislation that's in progress. So it's an opportunity for you to share what you've learned, and hopefully we can make an impact on how our broader society thinks about addiction in the context that we've learned about today. All right, do those sound like good ideas? Okay, so on your way out, make sure you get a little piece of paper from the people standing by the doors. Have fun.